Hello, what a fabulous occasion this is going to be. My name's Eleanor Robson and I'm the head of the history department here at UCL. Hello to everybody here in the Gustave Tuck Lecture Hall and hello to everyone watching on YouTube. It's a real honour to be introducing Professor Matthew Smith tonight. UCL, I think, is incredibly lucky to have lured Matt away from home, from the University of West Indies, where he was chair of the Department of History and Archaeology, and where he has established himself as one of the foremost historians of the Caribbean, in particular of Haiti, to come and join us as the director of what is now called the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, one of the university's flagship centres, which began under the aegis of Professor Catherine Hall, who I'm very pleased is here tonight as well, and with her team, Nick Draper, Keith McClelland and Rachel Lang really set up the study of what was then the Legacies of British slave ownership to be real game changer in the way that we think about the way in which the economic foundations of this country are built on the backs of the enslaved. And it has really, as we all know, fundamentally opened conversations in this country and beyond, really difficult and important conversations about the ways in which the past resonates today and the ways in which history can serve serious reparative work. So it was really exciting and important for us that Matt was able to join us and to bring Catherine and her team's great foundations forward and into new directions. So you'll be hearing about that this evening and lots of really exciting developments. Before we get into the exciting thing, just one very boring thing. There are fire exits. We will not have a fire alarm, but if you do, just make sure that you don't panic. You leave the room by the fire exits. Take the stairs if you can. The lifts will be out of action, and we will be safe, and everything will be fine. So, without further ado, I am going to hand over to Professor Smith to give his inaugural lecture for us. Thank you very, very much indeed, Matt.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see so many people in the room, and also good evening to everyone who is tuning in online. It's a tremendous honor to be able to spend time with you and to share with you some of my work, some of the developments in my work over the course of my professional life. It's also an honor to do the work that I'm doing here at UCL that Eleanor mentioned in her wonderful introduction of me. That is to lead the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, which has been a foundational center that's done remarkable work in the time that it's been instituted, spearheaded by Catherine Hall, Keith McClelland, and Nick Draper. And I am honored to take the mantle of leadership of that center now at this particular point in time where it has laid such a foundation. I also am very delighted to be able to talk about how much of the work that I've done as a professional historian fits into much of what the center has done, but more broadly, how it fits into how we understand Caribbean history. And that's what I invite you to spend time with me breaking apart in some senses as we think about Caribbean history and approach it from a very wide lens. We'll start with a quote. We begin on Church Street. It lies in range of the long-barreled stair of Queen Victoria, unyielding on her plinth. Eyes face south to the harbour in this capital of Caribbean capital, Kingston City, Magic City. Church Street is bookended at its leeward entry by a cross-stitch of lanes and streets grouped by theme: the apostolic, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John; the nautical, north, south, east, west; the fluid, rum, water. They run perpendicular to the larger thoroughfares that bear the names of their London elders: King, Duke, Regent, Queens, and so on. The city is not thought of by its elite as Little London for nothing, nor is it to be confused with the other Little London, an actual place in Westmoreland Parish many miles from here. Kingston is Kingston, and Kingstonians are creations of the collision of foreign imagination and defiant human experience. Church Street, like its peerage, is packed, ochre, and noisy. The small shop at number 23, with the skull and crossbones on a thin piece of board blazoned with the words, "'Tis a matter of time," might be the noisiest. Inside, there are clicks and the motorized ticking sounds of crown wheels, regulators, and tensely notched gears, churning in syncopation with the low motion of the grandfather's pendulum. From the back, there are voices, loud, bellicose even. Voices that jar the steel rhythm of the watchmaker's shop. Voices in various stages of upset over the state of the empire and the Great War. It is at this small writing desk in that smaller room that the proprietor of this establishment, Mr. John Augustus Soulet, is sat with pen in one hand and head in the other. Away from his watches, his gears, and his chains, John Soulet is on this 5th day of June, 1927, preoccupied with the contents of a panegyric to the British Empire that had been published in the island's paper, the Daily Gleaner, just 3 days before. Soulet is a controversial man. He thrives on this reputation. He suffers no fools. His first watch repair shop was not far from number 23, at the intersection of Church Street and Water Lane, a location that was called Amen Corner with pride. He waxes habitually on the past with a judgmental air about him. This tendency made him pleasantly called Sir John by everyone who passes him by, and it has made him a major voice of public authority in Kingston. Reporters seek him out to interview him on current affairs. His fans and enemies alike read with delight and aggravation his short essays in the papers. Sir John is, by his own proclamation, the premier of the Church Street political cabinet. When he ran for alderman of Kingston, a position he would win in 1931, the crowds were large. They were larger when he toured the island in support of black candidates for the Legislative Council in national elections. Sir John was taken seriously even by those who said he should not be. Those bold enough to confront him came to Amen Corner at their own risk and got caught in swirling sermons on everything from the direction of Indian resistance to ancient Egyptian history. No subject bothered Sir John more than the British Empire. He grew angry whenever it was blindly praised. He called the local government a sham. The real rulers of the island were the Imperial Association, the West India Committee, and the Colonial Office. He chastised the council for hiring Englishmen to take jobs he believed could be better done by Jamaicans. Visitors from Britain were so incensed by Sir John's words in the press that some wrote their own rebuttals in which they reminded him and all Jamaicans that whatever freedom they enjoyed was given to them by white Englishmen, and they only occasionally spoke about English women, and that Jamaicans should be grateful rather than resentful to receive any notice at all from the mother country. Our mother England, this is a quote, freed the slaves. She spent tens of thousands of pounds on Sir Alfred Jones's direct line, gave and lent us hundreds of thousands of pounds after the earthquake of 1907, and widows and orphans are now draining money from this source, end quote. This was what was in the article on his desk, crumpled and moistened by Sir John's close grip. It was written by a group of people called Admirers of the Old Lady and concluded, "Our mother has been remiss in some things, but let us consider that to err is human, to forgive divine. And in some things, but let's consider that to err is human and to forgive is divine. And now that the old lady is getting possibly in her second childhood, let all of her children rally around her and with brains and money come to help her." Written that summer day in 1927, Soulet's response to this was a short essay he titled "Sentiment and the British Empire." It contained all the fury and historical vision that had made him adored and avoided. This is Soulet. The fairy tale of benevolence of how our mother England freed the slaves forces a smile. The aged nonsense of freeing the slaves on her plantations as a benevolent act is entertained only by vacuous minds which are unconscious of economic laws. Emancipation was a great business effort of the capitalists of England. Neglected by the old lady while she rolled in wealth and while she contributed to the welfare and happiness of outsiders who today will not even acknowledge their indebtedness, much less pay, the admiring circle tells us to be sentimental. As the article turned toward its conclusion, Soulet grew more strident. The foreign capitalist still reaps the benefit of our £50,000, a reference and miscalculation of the £20 million of compensation money paid to the planters at emancipation. He invoked the Haitian Revolution in his rebuttal. Quote, "England would have shared the same fate as her neighbors in being kicked out by the slaves if she had persisted on such economic lines, as the slaves had knowledge of what had occurred in Haiti and elsewhere. Haiti had shown in Toussaint a warrior, not only by beating Napoleon, but also showing great ability during his administration as an economist and statesman," end quote. In an earlier commentary on the same subject, he questioned the expectation of colonial sentiment for the metropole when he wrote, quote, "The English have never been sentimental as far as Jamaica is concerned. England has grown rich at the expense of much blood, both black and white, in establishing the foundation of her great wealth. Whenever she has been assailed, we have never hesitated to make practical sacrifices for her in both blood and money." John Soulet was an early advocate for self-government in the British Caribbean. He considered the present state of the colonies in the 1920s and the Caribbean as a whole against the brutal history of slavery that created the economically constructed plantation worlds of the archipelago. His strong views on the importance of the Haitian Revolution to that search for freedom derived from his heritage. Soulet, according to his 1946 obituary, was born in Haiti, and his family quite likely came to the British island from Saint-Domingue as part of a great exodus of the late 18th century during the events of the Haitian Revolution. His foreign background was fodder for his detractors. Even Marcus Garvey, a frequent debater with Soulet, often referred to Soulet not having a good grasp on English grammar when he was trying to one-up him. But it did not interfere with his assessment of possibilities that the new century held for true redemption for Jamaicans and people in the British colonies. Crown Colony was a trap. More representative government was the only thing that could make Jamaica a truly free place. Soulet, his allies, like the Bahamian doctor politician Robert Love, who lived in Haiti for decades, and his sometime adversaries, like Garvey, always found common ground on the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution and the example of Toussaint Louverture was a binding force for over a century for Caribbeans who may have been freed from slavery, but still chafed under the hold of empire. Whatever Haiti's failings, the example of what it achieved was indication of the great capacity of black people. Haiti's independence in 1804, which brought both emancipation and decolonization, was a significant moment in Caribbean history. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, after Toussaint, and with thousands of determined freed people, took the country to their victory. The memory of this extrication of slavery and colonialism meant it was reflected dramatically in the broken, asymmetrical remains of San Souci Palace. Built by King Henry Christophe between 1810 and 1813 by hundreds of former captives, many worked again to their death, San Souci was meant to be greater than any great house, a marvel for the world to see and never forget, a monument to black revolutionary achievement and its audacious and tormented consequences. What Haiti achieved in the opening decades of the 19th century was first energetically advocated by the Caribbean generation that lived through it. In the 1820s to the 1830s, when the British anti-slavery campaign was most fevered, Haiti was referenced by a middle class in Jamaica that desired a post-slavery connection with the Black Republic. This is a view from 1838. Quote, "The time is now gone by for any dread of Republican principles of freedom being imported here to disturb the present state of society. Slavery no longer exists. The people are now all free, so that the intercourse which might be established between Jamaica and Haiti should be started." It was Haitians who knew best how fragile that freedom was in those early decades. One of the leading political and intellectual men of the early republic was Joseph Balthazar Ignac. Ignac left Saint-Domingue in the 1790s, that was the French colony before it became Haiti in 1804, to take up exile in Jamaica with his family at the outbreak of the violence in the north. He would remain in Jamaica until 1802, when, according to him, this is his words, the Peace of Amiens between England and France took place, and as it was a question of returning to slavery in Santo Domingo, those who had been freed from it, and as the alternative of this new enslavement was to necessarily produce a collision between those who were to be re-enslaved and those who were to effect change. He then returned to Saint-Domingue for the final stages of the revolution, and this was his reason for returning. "I went for the defense of the freedom, since I could not bear prejudices of color," end quote. He would serve long years as Secretary of State under Alexandre Pétion and Jean-Pierre Boyer between 1820 to 1843. Ignac was one of the engineers of the constitutional mechanisms intended to preserve Haitian freedom. Many of his actions, as those of his fellow statesmen, were driven by a desire to protect non-white freedom in a hostile world of empire, and peculiarly an authoritarianism in domestic affairs. To wit, Ignac was both orchestrator of the appeal to African Americans to relocate to Haiti, where they would be considered freed people, and the Rural Code of 1826 that imposed highly restrictive control on freedom of movement of the Haitian peasantry. When a rising from the south overthrew Boyer in 1843, Ignac fled once again into exile to British Jamaica, joining dozens of other Haitians in Kingston who would eventually be part of the deep network of 19th century Caribbean migration. It was there, from the rutted lanes of an earlier incarnation of Jean Soulet's Kingston, that he wrote his memoirs, precipitated by a new Haitian liberal thrust to chastise the first generation of freedmen and women as traitors to the Republic. If he was critical of them and defensive of what he had done in power, it was because he argued he loved his country. This is his quote from his memoir. "Who is the sensible man who could not measure the sad fruits of a revolution? We're called upon to participate in it, and without whose help nothing could have been carried out, especially if he thought of the salvation of a country above all," end quote. Freedom was an evolving concept at the time Ignac wrote those words. When slavery ended in the British Islands fully in 1838, the new context enabled freed people to seek degrees of autonomy over their lives. How they spent their time, who they worked for, what their children learned, and importantly, where they went, was part of a small power that they took seriously. But they were assessed by a colonial force that never ceased to remind them that their freedom was conditional. On the eve of full freedom, in July 1838, a Scottish missionary traveling around the island of Jamaica admonished the soon-to-be-free apprentices with these words: "If you become idle and careless, or allow the cultivation of the country to go back, you will fulfill all the predictions of your enemies and do more to perpetuate slavery than anything that has been done for many years. What will religion say? What will your friends in England say? What will the united and uplifted voices of the world say?" End quote. It was views like this that gave Haiti the prominence it enjoyed among a newly empowered non-white political class in the immediate post-emancipation period. Haiti, under Boyer, might have been undemocratic, as Haiti would remain for more than a century to come. But it demonstrated stability in the Caribbean under freedom. When Boyer fell by a coup, the first of many in Haiti, it did not dash hopes. In the crisis years of 1842 to 43, one Jamaican editorialist wrote of Haiti and Haitians this way. And this is an editorial from 1843, quote, "More has been expected of them, the Haitians, than would be from any other set of men. And this seems to us to have arisen out of the circumstances, the peculiar circumstances, namely the oppressions of Negro slavery, having been brought a nation of free men in the world. Granting all that has been alleged against Haiti and the Haitians to be correct, still the question recurs, would any other body of men placed in precisely similar circumstances have done better, on the whole, in the same period of time? They had obtained liberty by an exertion of physical force and could only hope to maintain it by the same means," end quote. The events that marked Haiti in the years after Boyer, coups, the Empire of Seluk in the 1850s, the Civil War of the 1860s, and the British Caribbean, the demise of King Sugar after 1846, immigration from Asia, more rigidly defined social divisions, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865, late century attempts at reorganization, a maturing sense of imperial neglect, and the expansions of new views of missionary civilization, all these events had transforming effects on interpretations of freedom. Half a century after freedom from slavery, the combination of these historical forces led imperial writers to conclude that black freedom had produced nothing of value in the Caribbean. Most infamous of all was J.A. Froude, whose English in the West Indies drew a bitter critique sustained for a century by Caribbean writers. The Caribbean islands, according to Froude, and these were his words, were valued only for the wealth which they yielded, and society there has never assumed any particularly noble aspect. There has been no saint in the West Indies since Las Casas, no hero unless Filonegro enthusiasm can make one out of Toussaint. There are no people there in the true sense of the word, with a character and a purpose of their own," end quote. Froude, to be sure, was the best known of the English writers of Caribbean post-slavery freedom and cannot be properly analyzed in isolation of other writers of the period. But the views he expressed, whether common or not, betrayed the disconnect from what obtained in the region and what was being understood in the metropole. The half-century since emancipation in the British Islands was for the people in the colonies an opportunity to measure what they had become in freedom, presented in firm denial of Froude and others. In the book, What We Are and What We Hope to Be, published in 1888, Jamaican Reverend R. Gordon captured an attitude that will be espoused more vigorously later on. Quote, "It has repeatedly been asserted that the black population of Jamaica and by extension the Caribbean have had no history. For 200 years under the galling yoke of slavery, what could be expected but a crushing out of his manhood, a gradual but certain destruction of every vestige of the principles and lingering virtues that distinguish him, even as uncivilized man. As a British subject in a British colony, the black man of Jamaica has a history. There are not only probabilities, but possibilities in the Negro character which we trust time and favorable circumstances will develop," end quote. The future of black achievement that Gordon wrote about was fixed on the new century. Implicit in that program was a memory of slavery that was more explicitly connected with lingering European colonialism and the encroaching arm of U.S. imperialism. In Port-au-Prince, in December 1903, a few weeks before the celebration of the centenary of Haitian independence, President Legacies encouraged supporters to post placards around the city in which the memory of 1804 was presented as a memory of oppressive white rule. The British consul in Port-au-Prince, Arthur Vansittart, worried that such feelings as evoked in the placards, and this is one of them here on the screen, would incite new violence against foreigners in the country. There were legitimate causes for concern. But what was also a cause for concern would be what happened if the United States came in. And this was a cause for concern not only in Haiti, but by people who had supported Haiti and aligned themselves with Haitian freedom in other parts of the Caribbean. Should such an event come to pass, the independence of Haiti would become a thing of the past, wrote a Jamaican commenter. Indeed, it is now merely a question of time when the Black Republic shall become a dependency of America, end quote. Alexis railed against such possibilities. He instructed adherents to place placards in the Capitol, other ones, that bore images of chained Africans underneath notices that said this is what Haiti would become if the United States was ever to occupy it. But Haiti was indeed tilting toward occupation, and what was considered there and elsewhere a surrender of its sovereignty. When in the 1920s, Jean Soulet, like so many other West Indians, wrote so admiringly of Toussaint as the avatar of black freedom, they did so in a context in which Haiti had become, like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, a country under the press of U.S. military control. That Caribbean generation of the 1920s and 30s, the generation of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, of Fernando Ortiz and Negrismo, of Jean Price-Mas and the Indigenistes, of jazz and the Harlem Renaissance, leftism and Ethiopianism, of Césaire negritude, the generation made by the Great War, that generation redefined freedom in relation to empire. The narrators of the 19th century that craved acceptance as freedom were caught in a vice that stymied independent imaginaries. If they were proud of their British subjecthood, it was out of an awareness of what that meant for their sense of identity and rights. They also understood, as Soulet did in 1927, that it was the blood and money of their ancestors that built the empire as much of that of any other British subject. Criticism of empire on the grounds that it reinforced Froude's dusty pessimism in Black destiny was not in opposition yet with imperial belongings. When the British Islands marked their own centenary of emancipation, the articulators of this idea were clear on where they stood in the minds of the colonial elite. At the same time, some defended empire as the only source for order, and order as the only guarantor of freedom. Consider these views by Jamaican publics in August 1838 on the centenary of full freedom in Jamaica. This is the Attorney General for Jamaica, Foster Sutton. Emancipation is not only getting away from physical slavery, it is getting away from ignorance, superstition, suspicion, and fear. How far can Jamaica pride herself on freedom and emancipation in this wider meaning? We can only free ourselves. This is a very solemn thought, end quote. A prominent Jamaican social worker, Judith de Cordova, this is what she said. This beautiful island of ours that we all love is but a tiny speck in the world. If we all work together, if we root out and destroy graft and ganja, if we teach and make possible the use of birth control amongst the poorer classes, Jamaica will finally realize its freedom. Alexander Bustamante, Labour leader and future Prime Minister, said this: "Let us on this day, 100 years later, think of the good the Queen has done and continue showing our appreciation by doing nothing to disturb the peace and tranquility of the island," end quote. And finally, from New York, Reverend William Ernest, Archbishop of the African Orthodox Catholic Church and member of the Jamaica Progressive League, a group that was advocating quite fervently for self-government by then, said this: we are Jamaicans, not Englishmen. And Jamaica, not England, is our motherland. Therefore, let us from now on be loyal to Jamaica and to ourselves as Jamaicans, end quote. Real freedom for the Reverend and the other members of the JPL comes with self-government. It is apparent from these views how vexed the question of freedom had become by the late 30s. They cannot be abstracted from the context in which they were made. The formal ending of U.S. occupation in Haiti in 1934, heralded by Haitian intellectuals as a second independence, a new freedom, and the labor unrest that engulfed the British Islands between 1934 and 1939 forced a reassessment not only of freedom, but of the memory of slavery. For all the effort that the colonial apparatus had made to disremember slavery and celebrate only abolition, the tensions along class, color, race, and imperial lines forced that memory to the surface of public discourse. In 1936, with the stirrings of antagonism already surfacing, Esther Chapman, a white British writer and playwright living in Kingston, sensed the volatility of how this history of the memory of slavery was shaping a new national consciousness. In a play that she wrote, which was staged in Kingston called The West Indies, She set a contemporary dinner party on the grounds of a former sugar estate. The party disturbed the unsettled ghost of an enslaved man who enters the living room in human form. He comments extensively on what he finds: the dress, the manners, the attitudes of the assembled colonials, the elite superiority, and concludes that a century after emancipation, the social circumstances had not changed. The play was regarded as offensive to the city's elite and did not last long, nor did Chapman's progressivism in the wake of the labor rebellions in 1937. Chapman's imagination was fiction, but the politics that nourished it were real enough. Outside in Kingston, Port of Spain, Bridgetown, Georgetown, Port-au-Prince, 20th century Caribbeans entering a new age of war found a redeemed urgency in their search for a lasting freedom. The early generation of Caribbean historians, inspired by these and other global events, wrote new interpretations of the past. The twin pillars of Caribbean history writing of this era, written by two Trinidadians, C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, and Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. These works and the endurance of their influence exemplify best how much these Caribbean ideas were maturing. James and Williams were expanding on a view long held in the region, in which imperialism was less monolithic than their predecessors had assumed. The question that arose from all these debates was this: what might a post-colonial order, a new freedom in the mid-20th century Caribbean, look like? Again, Haiti took the lead. In the 1940s, a new nationalism fired by radical impulses took root and spread. All the failures of independence and insults to emancipation were weighed and debated and then angrily taken out of the salons into the streets along Grand Rue. This period in the Caribbean search for freedom, a period I spent the first part of my professional career studying very closely, holds clues to the possibilities and perils of struggles for universal liberty as it was understood in the journey to full decolonization in the region. The hangover of the U.S. occupation, with its racialist assumptions that marked Haiti's second independence, its second birth of 1934, were unresolvable. Francois Duvalier, then a young medical doctor who spent more time studying Haitian culture than his practice, wrote in a famous text from 1945 that 1804 was, quote, an evolution, not a revolution, end quote, because the elite were still in control. True Haitian freedom, he argued, in the wake of global conflict, could only come when the authentic representatives of the majority population, men like him, became the rulers. Max Sam, a founder and general secretary of the Haitian Socialist Party in 1944, and prominent opponent to Duvalierist Norism, because of his appeal to color over social class divisions, told me in an interview I had with him late in his life that the decision to create a real freedom through a black radicalism in the 40s was always going to be doomed because of the despotic traditions in the country. Despondent on what could be achieved, Sam conceded defeat to the authoritarian politics in order to survive in his native land. He did not want to leave Haiti. Many others, too many, died, and far more left. The migration of Caribbean people to seek for themselves a freedom denied at home accelerated in the wake of all this disappointment. Havana, Kingston, Fort-de-France, Charlotte-Amalie, then Montreal, Paris, Toronto, New York, Miami, London, all became magnets for Caribbean arrivals by ship and plane. As they made new homes, a different surrender took hold. The story is well known. Post-war racism, the reductive appraisal of Caribbean value to contribute to metropolitan advance, was unrelenting wherever they settled. And yet, even in these spaces, a new freedom was prized from the encasement of foreignness. Una Marson, the Jamaican who became the first black woman to work as a broadcaster on the BBC, found this space one afternoon in 1940 in Hyde Park. As she told it to her audience, she was rushing to an appointment when moving swiftly past the speakers, standing on boxes, and proclaiming the end of the world. She happened upon a group of Jamaican revivalists. Clutching their copies of Moody and Sankey songs and dressed well, they created in that crowd a space of freedom for themselves. So alluring it was, so captivating its spirit, that Marson forgot her appointment and joined them for an hour, singing the song she remembered hearing her grandmother sing in St. Elizabeth. For Marson the poet, England was isolating and prejudiced for the West Indian. But for Marson the emigrant, these moments of life infuse the will to not just exist in the 20th century, but to make of the legacies of freedom, of migration, a way to preserve what had been gained since emancipation. To her West Indian listeners on the BBC, she relayed her understanding of why this was so important. In a March 1940 BBC broadcast of Calling the West Indies, she said, quote, "I think that some of my colonial friends are still puzzled about this very strange war. It is the old struggle as to whether tyranny or liberty shall survive in our world. To me, there can be no motive for living if my individual rights as a human being are taken away. So far as my race is concerned, there is no question as to our fate under Nazi regime. Hitler himself has stressed this with brutal frankness. Our young and virile race must never again be chained in the galleys. More and more I find myself bound up in the universal fight for freedom, for I know that if by any chance the Allies should ever lose this war, our hopes of greater freedom will be darkened for many decades to come." Back in the Caribbean, the events in Europe cast against the events at home in the 30s watered a fierce nationalism. Jamaican writer and painter Roger Mays in 1944 read with anger that the lessons of the war, the Second World War, had not convinced the British government of the failings of empire, wrote famously and facetiously that, quote, "May the sun never set upon the great British tradition of democracy, which claims men and women, which chains men and women with more than physical chains, chains them in dungeons of gold mines and silver mines, and upon sugar plantations, and upon rubber plantations and tea plantations," end quote. Mays was locked up for saying this. 6 years later, on the eve of his own migration to England, he wrote differently about where freedom might exist. Like Soulette in his 70s, Max Sam in Port-au-Prince, when I met him at the opposite end of his fiery Marxism of a younger man, Mays believed that personal freedom required concessions to the very thing he fought against. This is him writing in 1950. "If I have anger, it is for a cause. If more of my fellow Jamaicans, a sufficient number more, could know that kind of anger, we would not have the kind of government we have today. The Philistines are encamped here. They're not only encamped, they're securely entrenched." It is impossible to appreciate these contrasts in Mays' words without placing them within the context I have presented. To understand Mays' significance, his friend Norman Manley wrote, one has to begin by remembering that Jamaica belongs to an area that has a long and bloody history of battle and conflicts between European powers and a long and ugly history of colonialism and slavery. Mays and Marson would both return to the Caribbean, like so many others, who hoped that freedom in a post-war world would mean greater power for their descendants, for the descendants of the captives who made so much of this history. The late 50s brought the promise of something. The election of historian turned politician Eric Williams in Trinidad in 1956, the short-lived federation of the English-speaking islands, the Castro Revolution of 1959, the shimmer of democracy in Haiti in 1957. One of the slogans was, "Vote so that we can finally be free." And the acceleration towards full self-government in the British Islands in the 60s. All these movements made real the possibilities of freedom. In Haiti in 1946, the young radicals chastised their forebears for having failed. The revolt that they made was to be the fulfillment, they said, of the dreams of the fighters of independence. That project was usurped by Duvalier in 1957, who claimed himself the political heir to Dessalines. In the colonized British Islands, there were similarities. The youth that came of age in the 60s assessed the women and men of the 30s and rejected their approaches. Too many compromises had been made to colonialism. Walter Rodney, then a 20-year-old Guyanese history major in Jamaica, called for a complete decolonization of the university curriculum as the first necessary step in achieving the psychological freedom that colonialism had denied Caribbean people. This was the dawn of what came to be known in the Caribbean as freedom time, a time in which the memory of slavery was treated as mortar for building indigenous institutions. More powerfully, for rejecting external visions of Caribbean history. Stated with characteristic precision by Guyanese historian Elsa Gavayo after independence in Jamaica in 1962, Caribbean societies were, quote, still changing and still the same, end quote. In the reviews of Caribbean history that emerged in these years, slavery was the foundational horror. The generation that brought independence and were birthed in it were to be avengers of the Africans brought to the Caribbean in brutality. They were to avenge their more immediate predecessors, survivors who mostly lived in a confusion, and that was how they saw them, of British histories of themselves. The words again of Walter Rodney, the student, quote, "Linked with the externalistic approach to West Indian history is the fact that this history has been a colonial one. Hitherto, it has been assessed by people looking at it from a metropolitan point of view. It is one of the tasks of the historian of the West Indies to approach the society in a different manner and to lay emphasis on precisely what was going on within the region," end quote. Eric Williams, writing at the close of the 60s and with the confidence of leader and historian, was more acerbic in his attack on earlier historiography. Quote, "The British historians wrote almost as if Britain had introduced slavery solely for the satisfaction of abolishing it. They have made such play of the compensation provided by Britain to the planters as wiping off the debt to the West Indians in respect of slavery, that it is difficult to not see in this attitude, developed and propagated over a century and a quarter, the explanation of the British government's attitude on the West Indies," end quote. These views, it must be repeated, emerged in freedom time, the heady years of the 1960s. The promise of new brought on by decolonization was tremendous. So too were the expectations. To make of the Caribbean and its history fertile ground for new growth brought terrific pressures on the new leaders. In the context of emergent African nationhood, civil rights, and the crush of economic challenges, centuries of colonial education that nothing worthwhile came from the Caribbean was absorbed by an angry generation demanding to make new visions of freedom. As Haiti and Cuba remained tied to one-party rule, and men who had vastly different views of what Caribbean freedom was to be, the newly independent Anglophone islands protested, wrote, and spoke about a new Caribbean black freedom. The political leader could take from this an opportunity to rise. Michael Manley, Jamaica's prime minister for the 70s, grasped this energy and what it meant for post-colonials. Manley would become a spokesperson of the region. In 1972, in the freshness of possibility, he wrote that slavery had conditioned the social circumstances that hindered Caribbean progress. Manley's words, "The colonial system subsequent to the abolition of slavery continued to be oppressive in all respects other than the legal question of status that was involved in slavery." He continued, "Emerging from a background of sustained and total tyranny, it was inevitable that Jamaicans should enter the new conditions of legal freedom with a profound distrust of authority, which was inevitably associated with tyranny in the mind of every newly freed slave," end quote. It was not just detachment from authority. It was also a sense by the majority of Jamaicans that the nation itself could not be claimed by the descendants of freed women and men. Manley promised to repair that. It was not in the pages of his books, but on the hustings that Manley tapped into this sentiment about the deep scars of slavery. This is a man at his most rousing in 1976. We know that for 300 years we have lived under the system and all we got was slavery. And when we didn't get slavery, we got bad sugar prices. And when we weren't getting bad sugar prices, we were getting hovels to raise our children. And we said to the small farmer, we have said, "You who took to the hills to escape slavery and have been condemned by capitalism and colonialism to the hillside lands for 420 years, we have said, come down off that hillside and enter into your patrimony upon the flat lands of your nation," end quote. It was not difficult to understand why Manley's coming to power in 1972, like the ending of the US occupation in 1934 Haiti, or British colonialism in the 60s, was regarded by a generation of the early 70s as, again, another era of new freedom. Manley's nickname was Joshua, and the slogan in 72 was, "Joshua has set us free." None of this could be sustained. The pressures of expectations were far too great. Power's burden and temptations could not vanish in the afterglow of mesmeric oratory. Manley's critics charged him with tying Jamaica to a new form of oppression when he declared the country democratic socialist in 1974. Keeping Manley in power, one opponent said, was to, quote, "vote Jamaicans into slavery," end quote. The use of the word slavery here is purposeful and illustrative of how it was used as a threat in the cut and thrust of political contests for power. The forces that brought the political visions of a new national freedom to a close in a wave of violence and the powerful aftermath of the Grenadian Revolution, another great promise of Caribbean freedom, dented public memory of the purpose and cause of this new freedom. Slavery's memory has been read bitterly as having become a crutch used by self-righteous politicians of the 70s to reward undeserving comrades. The inheritors of that recent history have not dissociated it from the longer history, and so many students of Caribbean history see those pivotal post-colonial years as part of a warping of public memory. Through all of the periods I have discussed this evening, there has remained always another Caribbean story. It simmers and rises with time, drawing on resistant histories, the currency of the moment to create its own sustaining energy. The past of slavery and the psychic hold of its memory has always been the substance of Caribbean culture and art. From Cuban Santeria to Haitian voodoo, Trinidadian Shango, and Jamaican revivalism and Rastafari, the memory of pain and pride has survived and grown. The Rastafari in Jamaica, against immense odds, have for more than 80 years now been one of the leading preservers of this recall. You cannot plant Africans in 1655 and expect to reap West Indians now, said a Rasta slogan in 1960. Reggae music carried the story of freedom more faithfully than the people entrusted with state power. Just west of where Soulet's shop stood on Church Street were the hovels that Michael Manley often spoke about, places of cultural power that retained, despite the wider amnesia, the vivid memory of the closing perimeter of slavery and the flashing gleams of freedom. In the streets off Kingston's main roads are the interlocking yards of dense communities, kin to the clutter of Port-au-Spain's Quaysay, cousin to the sticky cubicles of Port-au-Prince's Bel Air, and the crowded cubes on the exhausted hills of Jalousie, and the many other popular communities of Caribbean capitals. In between these lanes and traces were sprouting recording studios in which the history that created those situations and the future that could lead beyond it were committed to thick black wax. We live in the present, learning from the past how to make a better future, wrote a cultural critic in Kingston in 1970, when reggae music was only 2 years old. And called, by the way, disparagingly by the island's elite, Booga Yaga music. This is a continuation of that quote. Music is a tangible, electrifying link of past, present, and future. And we must show respect and acceptance of our singers, musicians, and songwriters. Much of our history will be well recorded for our children and grandchildren, and musicians will become as much historians as writers in the future, end quote. It is in the music and its composite lyrics that the memory of slavery is refracted and kept. And here is just a taste of that. Depuis Bois Caïman, n'ap cherché liberté. They brought us down here to work on this big plantation. Oppression, oppression, we just could not take it. Just take these chains away and set me free. Do you remember the days of slavery? Didn't my people before me slave for this country? How will you be written when the history is right? Why can't we be what we want to be? We want to be free. The history of the Caribbean people, as C.L.R. James concluded in his 1965 lecture that I cited earlier, is the history of freedom. But to know that history and the people who made it requires us to interrogate the ways in which freedom was a mobile concept, growing multifocal in the period after slavery, then becoming something else again after colonialism. These moments when it was battered, contested, and reshaped itself are too often glossed over and misunderstood within and outside the region. But they give us the pieces of the Caribbean story. It has been the chief concern of my scholarship to look at those pieces, to understand the processes by which freedom was created, changed, breathed, lived, and remade. It is what the historians before me demanded of the future, and it remains the central responsibility of all of us who study this place and people, who far more than has been acknowledged have been at the center of global history making. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. Professor Smith, Matt, that was the most powerful and moving, deep and capacious study of a single word, the most profound concept over 200 years across the whole of the Caribbean and into Britain. As a historian of Babylon, the original oppressors, I found that really thought-provoking, and coming to it as an outsider, incredibly accessible, as well as I'm sure to those experts amongst you in the audience tonight. I'm sure full of new insights as well. For me, thinking about UCL as a centre of excellence in intellectual history and the history of political thought, you gave us really profound new ways to think about those things. And you showed us, Matt, that a whole range of media, the ones that historians traditionally think of pamphlets, of papers, of books, but also of plays, of song, of music, are all locations for political discourse, for intellectual public debate. And for me too, again, as an ancient historian, I found your use of photographic images incredibly moving and immediate. They enable us to empathise and to bring these very real struggles to life in a very profound and moving way. One of the phrases you've finished with, talking about the memory of pain and pride, I thought was a really effective way to summarise your approach, I think, to this really difficult topic, both intellectually difficult but also very emotionally difficult. We've been thinking over the past few months about the new MA in Public History that launches here in September. And in fact, I spent a very happy half hour earlier today on the UCL East Campus in the Olympic Park. And we've been thinking about how public history, which should and can, I think, make a difference, and how we take history out of the academic discourse and really make change to people's lives. And one of the ways that we're doing it is physically relocating it out of these very traditional settings into the very new setting of the Olympic Park. But I think too, creating much more porous physical spaces and intellectual spaces in which people who don't necessarily conceptualize themselves as historians feel welcome and encouraged and inspired and empowered to engage and understand how thinking about the past can really change the present. And I think this concept of freedom is something that we are all still battling with today in our everyday lives in many different ways, many of us more than others. But those of us who are more privileged to not have to think about these in our own personal lives, I think it's very important too that we stop and sit and listen to the pain and the struggle and help to reformulate what freedom means and how we make that meaningful and accessible to as many people as possible. So, Matt, thank you so much for all of this profound and yet accessible thinking on such an important topic. I would like to finish by inviting everybody downstairs to talk to Matt, to drink and eat with us and to celebrate this really amazing lecture, and just to acknowledge how privileged we all are in UCL and in London to have Matt with us as our one of our newest professors, and here is to many years and decades of very fruitful work to come. So thank you so much indeed, Matt.
Thank you.